On the suffocatingly hot and incredibly dangerous morning of July 20th, 1780, a solitary rider pushes his exhausted, mud-spattered horse to the absolute physical breaking point along the overgrown, rutted roads of New Jersey. He is not a uniformed continental soldier rushing away from a chaotic battlefield, and he is not carrying standard military dispatches. He is a civilian courier, operating entirely in the shadows, riding for a clandestine intelligence organization that officially does not exist on any Continental Army ledger. The saddlebags bouncing against his horse's flanks contain a single, seemingly unremarkable piece of paper that currently holds the fragile fate of the entire American Revolution. The message he carries is deeply encrypted, written in a complex, multi-layered numerical substitution cipher, further concealed by a chemical reactant in visible ink that requires a specific acidic wash to be read. It is meant for the eyes of only one man, an American commander operating under the highly classified code name Agent 7111. We know this commander today as General George Washington. The raw intelligence contained in the courier's hands is absolutely terrifying. It details a massive, highly coordinated enemy mobilization that is about to wipe out the only strategic hope the Americans have left in this grinding, brutal war. Imagine you are a commanding general in this exact moment. You have been handed control of an army that has suffered through years of catastrophic battlefield defeats, collapsing supply lines, freezing winter encampments, and constant, humiliating retreats. Your men are starving. They are unpaid, they are bordering on open mutiny, and they are vastly outnumbered by the greatest, most fiercely disciplined conventional military machine on the face of the earth. Now, imagine you receive verified intelligence that this unstoppable British war machine is currently assembling an overwhelming amphibious strike force, loading thousands of elite combat troops onto transport ships with one singular objective: to crush your most valuable international allies before they can even unpack their artillery on American soil. You have no troops to send to their rescue. You have no time to march across the country to reinforce their defensive lines. You are paralyzed by geography and a complete lack of operational resources. You have absolutely zero conventional military means of stopping the impending slaughter. How do you destroy a massive, heavily armed enemy offensive and save your entire war effort without firing a single shot? You do it by blinding your enemy, crawling inside his mind, and making him see exactly what you want him to see. To understand the absolute, cold-blooded genius of what George Washington is about to pull off, and why this specific intelligence dispatch is so critical, you have to deeply understand how utterly desperate the strategic situation is for the Americans in the summer of 1780. The American Revolution is effectively on life support, bleeding out from 1,000 logistical cuts. The British Army, under the command of General Sir Henry Clinton, firmly occupies New York City, holding the most vital, easily defended, and strategically important deep water port in North America. From his heavily fortified headquarters in occupied Manhattan, Clinton commands a professional, fiercely equipped, highly disciplined war machine that is backed by the undisputed global might of the Royal Navy. Washington, on the other hand, commands a fragile, crumbling force of freezing, starving Continentals who are currently shivering in the rugged highlands of New Jersey and upstate New York. History books almost always focus on the legendary suffering at Valley Forge, but tactically and logistically speaking, the winter encampment at Morristown, New Jersey in 1779 and 1780 was infinitely worse. It was the coldest winter recorded in North America in over a century. The continental supply chains had completely collapsed. The Continental Congress was entirely bankrupt, printing paper money that was virtually worthless, meaning local farmers outright refused to sell food to Washington's army, preferring to smuggle their crops behind enemy lines to sell to the British for hard gold and silver coin. Washington's men were eating tree bark, roasting their own leather shoes for sustenance, and dying of exposure by the hundreds. Morale was not just low, it was actively collapsing into violent insubordination. Entire veteran regiments were threatening open mutiny over their lack of pay and rotting rations. In a straight-up conventional force-on-force battle, Washington knows he loses, and he loses badly. The British have the sheer numbers. They have the naval supremacy to move troops anywhere along the coast, They have the heavy siege artillery, and they have the logistical supply chains to sustain long-term combat operations. Washington realizes something in the darkness of that Morristown winter that fundamentally changes the course of modern asymmetrical warfare. If you cannot outfight your numerically superior enemy on the open battlefield, you must outthink them in the shadows. You must know their exact movements, their troop dispositions, and their strategic intentions long before they ever make them. You must build an invisible weapon that can project power without requiring a single musket or cannon. That invisible weapon is the Culper Ring. This is not a group of trained military operatives, French intelligence officers, or elite aristocratic spies playing a gentlemanly game of espionage. They are entirely ordinary, working-class civilians. They are farmers, tavern keepers, quietly observant merchants, and pacifist Quakers living right under the noses of the brutal British military occupation in New York City and Long Island. They do not wear uniforms, and they do not carry weapons. They carry vials of experimental invisible ink invented by James J., complex numerical cipher books that replace hundreds of sensitive words with dedicated numbers, and they maintain a network of dead drops that is so fiercely secretive and highly compartmentalized that even General Washington himself does not know the true, legal identities of his most valuable top-tier agents. He only knows them by their assigned operational numerical codes. Abraham Woodhull, a chronically nervous but fiercely dedicated farmer from Setauket, Long Island, operates as the Ring's primary manager under the alias Samuel Culper. Robert Townsend, a quiet, unassuming merchant who runs a popular coffee house in the heart of occupied Manhattan, operates directly alongside British officers as Culper Jr. Townsend is the ultimate inside man, serving drinks to British generals, listening to their drunken boasts about troop movements, and reading the supply manifests of the Royal Navy ships docked in the harbour. And George Washington sits at the very top of this phantom pyramid as Agent 7111, directing their intelligence-gathering priorities from hundreds of miles away. Through this incredibly dangerous, highly illegal network, Washington is basically reading the British military playbook in real time. The risk these civilians are taking is absolute. The British military does not take prisoners when it comes to espionage. If any member of the Culper Ring is caught, the standard operating procedure is a swift military tribunal followed by hanging, a fate that Washington's previous spy, Nathan Hale, had already suffered. But having the raw information is only half the battle. What a tactical commander actually does with that intercepted information, how he weaponizes it against the enemy, is what separates a merely competent general from a legendary, history-defining one. And Agent 711 is about to face the ultimate, existential test of his phantom network. Before we dive into the specific tactical movements of July 1780 and see exactly how Washington orchestrates this impossible psychological deception, if you want to understand the hidden tactics, the intelligence operations, and the strategic masterclasses that actually built the modern world, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now, because we break down these historical military turning points every single week. The catalyst for this entire intelligence operation, and the moment that pushes the American Revolution to the absolute brink of total collapse or total victory, begins on July 10th, 1780. For years, the American diplomats in Europe have been begging the French crown for serious, committed military and naval support. They do not just need money and muskets anymore, they need professional boots on the ground. Finally, after agonizing delays, the prayers are answered. A massive French naval fleet drops anchor in the deep water harbour of Newport, Rhode Island. They bring with them approximately 6,000 highly trained, exceptionally equipped professional French infantry and artillerymen, under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau. This is the ultimate strategic game changer Washington has been praying for. This is the heavy, conventional army Washington desperately needs to finally take the fight directly to the British strongholds and end the grueling war. But there is a massive, immediate tactical problem that threatens to destroy the alliance before it even begins. An army that has just spent months at sea packed into the damp wooden hulls of transport ships is entirely vulnerable. When Rochambeau lands at Newport, he is not unloading a ready-to-fight combat force. He is unloading a floating hospital. The French soldiers are ravaged by scurvy, dysentery, and severe seasickness. Their cavalry horses are emaciated and weak from the brutal transatlantic voyage. The troops are disorganized, exhausted, and desperately trying to offload thousands of pounds of heavy siege artillery, highly volatile black powder, and basic survival supplies onto unfamiliar American shores. Tactically speaking, they need weeks, if not a full month, to build proper defensive fortifications, dig trench lines, recover their physical combat strength, and establish a secure perimeter around Newport. Right now, in the second week of July, they are sitting ducks. They have their backs to the ocean and no established land defenses. And General Sir Henry Clinton, watching from his headquarters in New York, knows exactly how vulnerable they are. General Clinton is historically known as a cautious commander, sometimes paralyzed by overanalysis, but he is certainly not a fool. He looks at the strategic map of the eastern seaboard and sees the absolute gold mine sitting completely exposed in Rhode Island. If he can organize a massive strike force and attack Newport right now, before the French have the time to dig in, mount their heavy guns, and recover their health, he can wipe out 6,000 elite European troops in one decisive surgical military blow. This would not just be a battlefield victory, it would effectively end the entire French-American alliance. The French crown would never send another army if this one was slaughtered on the beaches. It would absolutely crush what little American morale is left, and it would likely destroy the colonial rebellion for good. Recognizing this fleeting window of opportunity, Clinton moves with terrifying operational speed. He immediately begins gathering an overwhelming amphibious strike force in New York. He aggressively requisitions every available transport ship, merchant vessel, and naval escort in the heavily congested New York harbor, stripping the city of its maritime resources. He issues orders for 8,000 seasoned, heavily armed British regular infantry and Hessian mercenaries to march to Whitestone on the northern shore of Long Island. They are ordered to prepare to board the massive fleet and sail straight up the Long Island Sound to execute a devastating amphibious assault on Rhode Island. Let those numbers sink in. 8,000 fully supplied, highly disciplined, combat-ready British veterans, supported by naval artillery, preparing to assault 6,000 sick, unfortified, highly disorganized Frenchmen who can barely stand. It will not be a conventional battle. Tactically, it will be an absolute massacre. Right in the middle of this massive, earth-shaking British military mobilization, the invisible shield of the Culper Ring activates. Robert Townsend, operating in Manhattan, notices the massive requisition of ships and the sudden movement of elite British regiments out of the city. He passes this terrifying intelligence to Abraham Woodhull. Woodhull, operating dangerously close to the British staging grounds on Long Island, visually confirms the horrifying scale of the enemy plot. He knows that every single second counts. He scribbles a desperate, highly urgent dispatch and sends it hurtling down the shadow pipeline. The intelligence is passed to a rugged, fearless whaleboat operator named Caleb Brewster, who rows the encrypted document across the treacherous, heavily patrolled waters of the Long Island Sound in the dead of night, dodging British naval patrols and loyalist privateers. Brewster makes landfall in Connecticut and hands the dispatch off to Washington's Chief of Intelligence, Major Benjamin Tallmadge. Tallmadge secures the message, verifies the cipher, and hands it to the exhausted courier we saw at the very beginning of this breakdown, sending him galloping toward Washington's headquarters in New Jersey. The message itself is blunt, devoid of panic, but absolutely terrifying in its tactical implications. Woodhull has written, quote, 8,000 troops are this day embarking at Whitestone for the before-mentioned port, unquote. When the sweating, exhausted courier finally arrives at the American encampment and the intelligence reaches Washington's desk, Agent 711 reads the dispatch and the full, crushing gravity of the situation crashes down on him. Washington knows exactly what General Clinton is planning. He writes an immediate reply to Tallmadge, stating, quote, as we may every moment expect the arrival of the French fleet, a revival of the correspondence with the Culpers will be of very great intelligence, unquote. Washington now possesses the ultimate intelligence advantage. He knows exactly where the enemy is going, how many men they have, and when they plan to strike. But having the intelligence means absolutely nothing if you cannot act on it. And Washington is physically trapped. His own crumbling army is rotting in the highlands of New Jersey, hundreds of miles away from the vulnerable Rhode Island coast. He simply does not have the sheer numbers to launch a diversionary march on New York City. And even if he forced his starving men to march day and night, he could never physically reach Rhode Island in time to warn the French forces or reinforce their non-existent defensive lines. He is completely, hopelessly paralyzed by the unforgiving realities of geography, logistics, and mathematics. He knows with absolute certainty that the fate of the entire war, the survival of the French alliance, and the existence of the United States rests entirely on what he decides to do in the next few hours in that cramped headquarters. Faced with the imminent slaughter of his allies and lacking any conventional military options, Washington devises a tactical deception so audacious, so incredibly risky, and so psychologically manipulative that if it fails, the revolution dies on the beaches of Newport. He cannot fight Clinton with muskets or artillery, so he decides to fight him with paper, paranoia, and the British Army's own intelligence-gathering network. He is going to feed the British High Commander lies so terrifying, so perfectly constructed, and so operationally authentic that General Clinton will have absolutely no choice but to stop his massive attack. If you want to see exactly how George Washington constructs this masterclass in psychological warfare, completely controlling the mind of the enemy commander and saving the entire French army without risking a single American soldier, make sure you hit subscribe and check out part 2 of this tactical breakdown, where we detail the execution of the ultimate revolutionary deception. Washington sits down at his heavy wooden desk in the dim, flickering candlelight of his headquarters, pushing aside the endless, desperate reports of starving soldiers and unpaid militias. He is about to engage in a high-stakes shadow game that requires an absolute, flawless mastery of human psychology. He understands deeply that General Sir Henry Clinton is a highly methodical, incredibly cautious, and chronically anxious commander who is perpetually terrified of losing his operational base in New York City. New York is not just a strategic military stronghold for the British. It is the absolute political, economic, and logistical crown jewel of the British Empire in North America. It is their secure deep water port, their primary supply depot, and the symbolic heart of their occupation. If Clinton loses New York to a rebel army, he loses his prestigious career, his historical reputation, and quite possibly the entire North American continent. Washington decides to surgically weaponize this exact, paralyzing fear. He begins to draft a series of extremely detailed, highly classified, and entirely fabricated military orders. These are not simple letters containing vague threats or bluffs. They are a masterpiece of tactical fiction, a comprehensive, multi-layered blueprint for a massive, immediate, all-out American and Allied amphibious and land assault directly on the heavily fortified city of New York. Washington writes these fake orders with the meticulous, obsessive precision of a master architect building a lethal trap. He explicitly states in the fabricated documents that because Clinton is actively moving his 8,000 elite combat troops out of the city to attack Rhode Island, the primary defenses of New York are now dangerously depleted, spread incredibly thin, and fatally vulnerable to a coordinated strike. The fake orders outline exactly how the Continental Army, supported by local militia units, will march immediately to seize the city the very moment the British fleet sails away from the harbour. Washington does not just invent ghost armies out of thin air. He uses real, verifiable military data to make the lie absolutely indistinguishable from reality. He includes hyper-specific troop movements for actual Continental regiments, detailing their exact routes of march. He outlines precise artillery placements for heavy siege guns he does not actually have in position, calculating the exact trajectory needed to bombard British strongpoints. He drafts complex, highly realistic logistical demands, requisitioning hundreds of flat-bottomed boats for amphibious crossings and thousands of pounds of rations along specific approach vectors that make the invasion plan look incredibly authentic, heavily resourced, and utterly imminent. He uses the real names of his most aggressive commanding officers, assigning them specific, recognizable sectors of the British defensive line to breach. He makes it look like the Americans are not just planning a harassing raid, but are actively, currently, in the final operational stages of delivering a fatal, war-ending blow to the absolute center of British imperial power in the colonies. But drafting the fake invasion plans is only the first, easiest phase of this incredibly delicate intelligence operation. The far more dangerous, critical, and psychologically complex phase is getting these fabricated documents directly into the hands of General Sir Henry Clinton without making it look like a deliberate, orchestrated plant. Washington knows that if the intelligence looks too easy to acquire, British intelligence officers and counter-espionage agents will immediately flag it as a clumsy deception. Counterintelligence is fundamentally a game of psychology and perception. You cannot just hand your enemy a lie on a silver platter. You have to make your enemy bleed to uncover it. You have to make them believe they have outsmarted you through their own military superiority. It has to look exactly like a catastrophic, humiliating, and entirely accidental American security failure. The British command structure has to believe they have captured the intelligence prize of the century entirely through the vigilance of their own forward patrols. To seamlessly execute this, Washington summons a specific, highly reliable courier to his headquarters. He intentionally chooses a man known to frequently travel through the lawless, highly contested, and incredibly violent neutral ground of Westchester County, which lies directly between the American encampments and the British lines. This area is an absolute nightmare, swarming with brutal British cavalry patrols, ruthless loyalist militias known as cowboys, and opportunistic highwaymen who murder for a pair of boots. Washington hands this courier the fabricated documents. They are heavily sealed with official red wax, marked with the highest possible level of continental military urgency, and addressed to distant, high-ranking American field commanders. Then, Washington does something incredibly cold-blooded. He gives the courier a very specific, strictly mandated route to take. It is a route that Washington, utilizing the precise intelligence gathered by the Culper Ring, knows for an absolute verifiable fact is currently heavily patrolled by aggressive, fast-moving British dragoons. Washington is essentially sending his own man completely blind into a lethal trap. He is sacrificing his own courier, putting the man's life in extreme, immediate danger, simply to use him as the unwitting delivery mechanism for this psychological poison pill. The courier, completely unaware that he is carrying a fabricated death warrant meant to stop a British offensive, rides out into the dangerous shadowed expanse of the neutral ground. He pushes his horse through the wooded trails and rocky valleys, constantly looking over his shoulder, gripping his reins, listening for the sound of enemy cavalry. And exactly as Agent 711 calculated from miles away, the trap violently snaps shut. A heavily armed, highly aggressive British patrol ambushes the solitary rider. They swarm him, drag him brutally from his horse, throw him into the dirt, and violently search his saddlebags and clothing. They rip open the leather dispatch pouches and find the heavily sealed, highly classified military documents bearing the undeniable, verified signature of General George Washington himself. The British cavalry officers on the ground rip open the wax seals, scan the documents quickly by the fading light, and their blood runs cold. They realize immediately that they have not just captured a low-level rebel messenger, they have just intercepted the master operational blueprints for the immediate devastating destruction of New York City. The British Dragoon commanders do not hesitate for a single second. Standard patrol protocols and scheduled routes are completely abandoned. They realize the explosive nature of what they hold. They immediately rush the captured documents straight up the chain of command with absolute, frantic urgency. The papers are carried at a breakneck gallop across enemy lines, smuggled rapidly through the heavily fortified, heavily armed checkpoints of the British defensive perimeter, rushed through the bustling, highly militarized streets of occupied Manhattan, and placed directly onto the polished wooden desk of the Supreme Commander, General Sir Henry Clinton. You have to vividly, viscerally put yourself in Clinton's polished leather boots in this exact, heart-stopping moment of crisis. He is standing at the very precipice of total, historical, war-winning victory. His massive, unstoppable armada is currently loading at Whitestone. Thousands of his best combat troops, elite grenadiers and light infantry, are actively boarding the transport ships. The heavy naval guns of the escorting warships are primed and ready. He is just hours away from launching the entire fleet up the Long Island Sound to completely destroy the vulnerable French expeditionary force and definitively end the colonial rebellion forever. He can practically taste the prestigious knighthood, the royal favor, and the historical glory that will come from wiping out 6,000 elite French soldiers on American soil before they can even fire a shot. But now, all of that shatters. He is looking down at concrete, heavily sealed, undeniable proof that the exact moment his transport ships leave the New York harbor, George Washington is going to sweep down from the highlands like a terrifying, unstoppable avalanche and capture the absolute crown jewel of the British war effort. Clinton is a cautious man by nature, a commander who constantly analyzes and overanalyzes every possible strategic vulnerability to the point of paralysis. He stares at the captured documents under the candlelight of his office. He immediately brings in his top intelligence officers and adjutants to verify the handwriting, the specific military phrasing, and the wax seals. The signatures are authenticated as absolutely real. The troop dispositions listed in the fake orders perfectly match the fragmented, incomplete, and terrifying reports. His own network of loyalist spies have been feeding him about American encampments shifting in New Jersey. The logistical planning makes terrifying, undeniable sense. Washington has played directly, flawlessly, and ruthlessly into Clinton's absolute worst psychological fears. The confirmation bias is completely overwhelming. Clinton already secretly feared leaving New York vulnerable to chase glory in Rhode Island, and now he is holding a captured document that scientifically validates that exact deep-seated fear. The pressure inside the British headquarters in Manhattan becomes immense, thick, and suffocating. Clinton paces the heavy wooden floor of his office, his mind racing uncontrollably through the catastrophic geopolitical and personal consequences of losing New York to a starving rebel army. He looks out the window into the dark harbor, filled with his massive, incredibly expensive amphibious assault force. He looks back at the crumpled, dirt-stained rebel papers on his desk. He weighs the potential glorious destruction of the newly arrived French army against the absolute, unacceptable, career-ending loss of his own command center. He runs the brutal, unforgiving calculus of war in his head, and finally, under the crushing weight of Washington's phantom threat, the supreme British commander breaks. Exactly 1 year later, those exact same French troops, the very men who would have been slaughtered on the beaches of Rhode Island if not for the Culper Ring, will march side by side with Washington's Continental Army down to a small, dusty, heavily fortified tobacco port in Virginia called Yorktown. They will bring the incredibly heavy siege artillery that was safely unloaded in Newport. The powerful French Navy, emboldened by the survival of their ground forces, will successfully blockade the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any hope of British escape or reinforcement. And together, this massive combined Allied force will relentlessly trap a massive British field army under the command of General Cornwallis. They will ruthlessly bombard the British trenches into submission day and night, and they will force the final, catastrophic British surrender that definitively wins the American Revolutionary War and permanently shatters the grip of the British Empire in North America. Absolutely none of that happens. The legendary siege of Yorktown never takes place, and the colonial rebellion likely collapses in a tragic wave of starvation and despair if General Sir Henry Clinton successfully attacks Newport in the summer of 1780. The United States of America exists today as an independent nation in very large part because George Washington fundamentally understood that the paranoid, fearful mind of the enemy commander is just as critically vulnerable to a devastating attack as his exposed infantry flanks. Washington proved to the world that overwhelming brute military force, massive naval armadas, and thousands of disciplined, highly trained troops can be entirely dismantled and rendered completely useless by superior intelligence, flawless psychological manipulation, and the courage to lie flawlessly. He built an invisible, impenetrable shield of tailored information around his most valuable allies and manipulated the greatest military superpower on Earth into destroying its own offensive capability. This is the true, unfiltered, deeply uncomfortable reality of modern warfare. The history books are always filled with the glorification of open-field bayonet charges, massive deafening artillery barrages, and the heroic crossing of frozen rivers in the dead of winter. But the most decisive, war-winning battles, the ones that actually change the borders of nations, are very often fought completely in the shadows, entirely out of the public eye. They are fought with acidic invisible ink, incredibly complex numerical ciphers, perfectly fabricated documents, and the terrifying, unrecorded courage of entirely ordinary people who absolutely refuse to be seen, but are willing to risk the horrors of the hangman's noose to pass a single, folded piece of paper across enemy lines. The defining, nation-saving victory at Newport was won entirely in the dark, without a single casualty, by an intelligence network that officially did not exist. If you found this deep, granular, tactical breakdown of psychological warfare, espionage, and historical deception valuable, and if you want to continue uncovering the hidden intelligence operations and shadow tactics that actually shaped the modern world, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Hit that like button to support these incredibly deep historical dives, and let me know down in the comments below which impossible military strategy, historical spy network, or unbelievable tactical deception from history we should analyze and break down next.